Right, diving right in today. We're looking at some potential sanctions on Nigeria. And what's behind that? It's a pretty big deal when a country gets considered for sanctions.
Yeah, absolutely.
And it all kind of stems from reports that are indicating a truly alarming statistic. I mean, this is pretty major. Around 90% of killings of Christians globally are happening in Nigeria each year.
Yeah, that's a huge number, and it's really driven a lot of attention and concern recently.
That's a massive issue. And it's something that's now made its way into the halls of U.S. Congress.
Yeah.
There's been a hearing specifically on this topic, and that's what we're going to unpack today.
Exactly. We're going to try to make sense of all of this, what's being said, what's the evidence, and what are the potential implications here.
So the information that we're working with, a lot of it comes from this House Foreign Affairs Subcommittee hearing, specifically the Subcommittee on Africa.
Right. And it really gets to the heart of what we're talking about, the reported violence against Christians in Nigeria and how the U.S. government might respond to that.
So let's get into some of the specifics here.
Okay. Sounds good.
A key part of this hearing was the testimony of Bishop Wilfred Enagbi of Makurdi.
Right.
And he described the militant Fulani herdsmen involved in really stark terms, calling them terrorists flat out.
Yeah, his words were powerful, and he spoke about them operating with impunity. No fear of consequences.
Which is a chilling thought.
Absolutely. And his firsthand account is so crucial.
Yeah.
It really gives us a sense of the severity of what's happening on the ground, the human cost of this violence. It's not just numbers on a page.
Right. It really personalizes it.
Exactly, and helps explain why there's so much concern in Congress.
Absolutely. And it wasn't just his testimony that was pretty powerful. Chairman Chris Smith, who led the hearing, he didn't mince words either.
No, he didn't.
He was very critical of the Nigerian government, saying they're failing to protect their Christian citizens.
Yeah, and that criticism, it doesn't come out of nowhere. There's data backing this up, and it's really alarming. There's a report from the Observatory for Religious Freedom in Africa, and they documented over 55,000 killings and 21,000 abductions.
Wow.
Linked to religious violence in Nigeria just between 2019 and 2023.
That's a really short time span.
It is.
For such huge numbers. I mean, 55,000 killings. It's almost impossible to even fathom that scale of tragedy.
And it's hard to wrap your head around it.
Really puts this issue into perspective.
Yeah.
And when you see numbers like that, it raises questions about, what the international community's response has been and should be. And it also brings us to the political context here.
Yeah.
Smith specifically called out the Biden administration for removing Nigeria from the country of particular concern list.
Right. He was pretty pointed about that. And it's interesting because it was the Trump administration that initially put them on that list. So you see this back and forth.
Yeah. What does that list even mean? Like, for people who aren't familiar with the ins and outs of foreign policy,
pretty serious implications, basically. It allows the U.S. government to take more targeted actions, things like imposing sanctions or really ramping up diplomatic pressure.
So it's a big deal.
Yeah, it's a big deal.
To be on or off that list.
Exactly. And it's a tool that's been used, in different ways by different administrations, and it reflects those different views on how to handle religious freedom concerns abroad.
And this is all directly connected to the resolution that Smith has now reintroduced. What's the aim of that?
Basically, it's calling for Nigeria to be put back on that CPC list, designated as a country of a particular concern.
And what would that mean practically?
Well, it could pave the way for potential sanctions if this violence against Christians continues.
So sanctions are on the table?
Potentially, yeah. It's a serious possibility that's being discussed.
Wow. So let's talk about that justification. Like, why are sanctions even being considered? What's the reasoning there?
Well, Smith's been very clear. He calls this religious cleansing, emphasizing the need to hold those responsible accountable. And his argument is that the scale, the sheer brutality of the violence, it demands a strong response from the international community.
And he's clearly someone who believes that sanctions can actually be effective. He said that where sanctions have been enforced, change has followed.
Right. And that gets to the whole debate about sanctions, their history, their effectiveness.
Right.
It's a complex issue because sometimes they work, sometimes they don't. It really depends on the context, how they're implemented. There's a lot of factors at play.
But Smith seems to see them as a tool that can bring about change. And with his strong stance and knowing this history of, the CPC designation, what do you think are the likely next steps here, like from Congress or even potentially a future Trump administration?
Well, Smith seems pretty confident that Trump would be very proactive on this. He believes Trump would engage directly with the Nigerian president, Tinubu, and be willing to take, what he considers the necessary steps.
And what would those steps look like?
Well, based on everything we've discussed, it seems likely, reinstating that CPC designation would be high on the list, and then, potentially considering sanctions.
So this is definitely something to keep an eye on, and it's a rapidly evolving situation.
It is.
So to kind of bring it all together, we've looked at this congressional hearing.
Right.
Focused on the killings of Christians in Nigeria.
Right.
And it's revealed some truly alarming statistics, and there's this push to redesignate Nigeria as a country of particular concern, which would have a lot of consequences, potentially including sanctions.
Exactly. And those figures we talked about, over 55,000 killings, 21,000 abductions, they really show the gravity of this situation and the urgency behind the concerns being raised.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So for you, the listener, thinking about everything we've just talked about, this potential for sanctions, the back and forth over this designation and these really disturbing numbers, it raises a huge question.
Yeah.
When religious freedom is under threat like this within a country's borders, what are the appropriate roles for international actor?
Right.
How do you balance that with national sovereignty? It's a complex issue with no easy answers, but it's something we all need to be thinking about and grappling with.
I agree. It's a tough one, but it's a vital conversation to have.
Absolutely. Thanks for joining us today.
Thanks for having me.
And we'll continue to follow this story as it develops.
Definitely a lot more to come on this.
All right. Thanks, everyone.
Take care.